Joining us tonight on this News9 Digital Extra is Mark Hyman, the national correspondent for Sinclair Broadcast Group, national investigative correspondent, does a lot of work with Inside Your World Investigates. Mark, your most recent story coming out this week is talking about the road ahead for EVs. And so you kind of take a look at a promise that was made by the Biden administration and where it stands now. And you got some interesting perspectives. I want to start with that. You talked to Jack Fitzgerald, an owner of several dealerships. Why did you think that was an important perspective to get?
Well, let's go back to the beginning. Back in August of 2021, President Biden issued an executive order in which he said his goal was that 50% of all light-duty vehicles, which are pickup trucks, SUVs, and cars. So 50% of all new vehicles by the year 2030 would be zero emission, and that's plug-in hybrid, electric vehicles, and then fuel cell vehicles, of which there are very few. And I sure hope my dogs don't create a whole lot of havoc tonight. But the goal is to have a large number of electric vehicles sold. And of course, who sells cars? Dealers. So I had a lot of opportunity to pick from dealers. And I never met Jack Fitzgerald before until I reached out to him. But he's a guy who's been selling cars for 70 years. I mean, it's interesting. He's 89 years old. He's got dealerships in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Florida. And he's in a dealership every single day. He flies between the South and the North, and he's always on the office. And I thought, here's a guy who loves selling cars, and that's what he told me. He loves people. He loves meeting people. He likes making people feel happy. And he'll sell you whatever he wants. So he's not a person who has any kind of predisposition towards, for, or against EVs. He just wants to sell cars. And I just thought he was an interesting character and someone who's committed to this process. So I actually really enjoyed getting a chance to meet him personally and then spend a few hours with him and get to tour his facility a little bit. But interesting perspective he gave, I think.
And your other source for this, you spoke with Bob Gallion. Bob, go ahead. You want to talk a little bit about Bob and his background?
Well, actually, so I want to mention, two sources that appeared on air. And I want our viewers to understand that I spoke to many sources. So in the course of an investigation, we have to be frugal in how many people we can put on air. That's just the challenge we have. We don't have enough time. But oftentimes we speak to a number of people. And in the case of dealers, I actually spoke to more than one dealer. I thought Jack Fitzgerald actually gave a perspective that I thought would really be fascinating for the viewers. And then I spoke with Bob Gallion. And Bob Gallion is essentially worldwide known when it comes to electric vehicles. He invented GM's EV1. A lot of our viewers may not even remember what that was, but 1996. By the way, are my dogs out of control? Can you really hear them?
We're picking them up a little bit, yeah.
All right. Yeah, well, I have 5, so please don't judge me. So EV1 was rolled out by GM in 1996. It was on sale for about 4 years. They sold around 4,000 copies, versions, models, and that was it. They couldn't sell anymore. America was not ready for electric cars 30 years ago. So they stopped selling them, and that was the end of it. But Bob Gallion is known as the godfather of EV batteries. This guy is Mr. Battery. He knows more about car batteries, knows more about electric vehicles than anybody else in America. Again, I mentioned he's kind of world-renowned. So I thought if anyone could talk about EVs, it would be Bob Gallion. And he's clearly a cheerleader for EVs. He thinks they're wonderful. He thinks batteries are great. So I want our viewers to understand that we didn't go to this with a perspective of we want to put electric vehicles in a bad light. We're not here to pump them up. They are what they are. Our focus was take a look at what are the challenges to get to that 50% sales goal by the year 2030. Is it achievable? If not, what are the obstacles? Bob Gallion brought a great perspective to this. The last point I want to make about Bob Gallion was after he worked for a career for General Motors, he eventually worked for a company called CATL. It's a Chinese company. He was the chief technology officer. CATL is the largest manufacturer of batteries in the entire world. They're the largest manufacturer of EV batteries in the entire world. So these folks know batteries, and China is leading the world in terms of volume of sales of EVs for a number of reasons. So he had a front row seat for about 8 years at how a country can make the sale of EVs successful.
And so I think is what your piece does, and I want to kind of ask you this through your investigation. Do you find that it kind of has these separate entities? We have people who are maybe used to the gas vehicle. Obviously, we have the newer version. We have the EVs, the battery operated, and then we have the hybrid models, which a lot of people might be more familiar with over just the last 5-10 years. We've seen them grow in popularity. So to kind of ask, my question then would be, through your investigation, are you finding that people are on separate platforms with this, or do you think there is kind of an in-between that the country might be working towards?
Well, at least what we learned when we spoke with the dealers, and also some of the other sources I did speak with were also Automobile Trade Association representatives. I also put a request in to speak with Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. He actually declined our request, but the Biden administration did provide a senior administration official who spoke with us. In fact, I had 2 interviews with this individual, but they did not want to go on the record, which I believe speaks volumes. If an organization has a very strong opinion about something, but they don't want to be quoted on the record, it tells me that maybe their opinion isn't as strong as they think. Maybe they aren't as comfortable in their position. So, having spoken with all those people, I think what it comes down to, there are different kinds of stovepipes, if you will, of people who are interested in EVs. There's certainly the early adopters. They're the same people who adopted the iPhone when it first came out, and the VCR and microwaves. If you go back and look through history, there are always the early adopters of certain technology, partly because the entry price was really high. It was expensive. It was experimental. We didn't know if it was going to succeed. Think of the days before the microwave came in. People used to heat up their leftovers in the oven or on a stovetop. Now you put it in something the size of a bread box and it gets warm. Kind of weird. So there are the early adopters. They're the ones that are into the EVs early on. There are certainly those who like the idea of having some sort of mix of battery and gas, which is what the hybrids are. Most people are probably familiar with the Toyota Prius, which has been very successful. They also like the idea of perhaps being a little greener, if you will, perhaps a few less emissions. And then there are folks who aren't quite certain, what do I do next? And there is kind of the in-between part, which is the plug-in hybrids. Again, gasoline engine, also battery powered. They don't have the range of a Toyota Prius. They don't have the range of an EV like a Tesla, but it gives someone kind of an in-between. I think the biggest challenge, at least what we learned from the viewers, the biggest challenge for customers is trying to decide, do I take the risk to buy an EV not knowing how and when and where I'm going to charge it? The term we used in the program was range anxiety, which is what a lot of viewers have concern with. When they walk in and speak to the dealerships, that's one thing the dealerships told us. People want to know, if I buy it, where am I going to charge it? I mean, I think I can charge it at home, but I know I have to have some electrical work done to do it properly, but there's no place near my office. And that's a very large concern. That's one of the topics we address in our program, is the whole ability to charge or not charge EVs. And we're kind of in this weird phase where there aren't very many charging ports that have been installed, certainly not enough to reach the level that experts believe are necessary to meet the 2030 goal of EV sales. The companies involved in installing them, whether they're private companies for profit, whether they're private homes, worry, are they going to have a significant risk of installing something that may become obsolete really quickly? There really hasn't become a tipping point yet in terms of broad acceptance of EVs by the general public. As I mentioned in my piece, 80% of all EV sales today have gone to the top 20% income earners in this country. So right now, it's not a mainstream product.
We're talking to Mark Hyman, national investigative correspondent from Sinclair Broadcast Group, working on a piece that just came out this week, The Road Ahead for EVs. an Inside Your World Investigates piece. Mark, China's ability versus the US's ability when it comes to producing these batteries and making what is needed for these vehicles was really astounding. 70% of the batteries in EVs are made in China. 2 of the 5 critical minerals in Chinese controlled mines, those are all that are needed in these battery process. What does that say about China versus the United States? Can the U.S. get to that point, or even start to get to that point?
There are a lot of challenges going forward. So yes, there are 5 critical elements. In fact, they're referred to as critical elements by the U.S. Geological Survey. The U.S. government has designated these as critical elements because they are in short supply. 2 very significant ones are manganese and cobalt. Nearly 100% of the world's known manganese deposits are in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. About 70% of the world's cobalt deposits are in the DRC. Cobalt is what gives a battery longevity, keeps the charge longer, and you can continue to recharge. They call it recycling a battery. If you don't have manganese and cobalt, you're not going to have batteries. It just doesn't work that way. Not the batteries you need to move a vehicle. China got into the mining business in the Congo in the last 15, 20 years, and they started buying either interests or operational rights for all of these mines. So they control access to the mines, the original source material that's excavated, and then they have the 70% of the production capability worldwide. And really, if your viewers think about this for a moment, when we would buy small electronics, cell phones, radios, games, and so forth, nearly all of those batteries were actually manufactured in China. China was in the small electronics battery business for a long time. They dominated the battery business. And so when EVs started coming out, all they said was, we need to scale up the size. We need to go from batteries this big to batteries this big. They had kind of a head start because they've been working on batteries for so long. So this wasn't a leap from Tuesday to Thursday to all of a sudden we're in the EV battery business. They have been in the battery business literally for decades. They were astute enough to purchase these mineral rights. There are mineral rights in other areas around the world, such as nickel mining in Indonesia, that they've controlled. This brings up an interesting point because now we deal with what kind of relations do we, the U.S., or we, the West, have with China. If China controls all the bulk of the minerals to build large batteries for EVs, then we have to have good relations with them. That is the bottleneck. They can make the decision whether or not they're going to provide something, or what trade-offs they're going to make. What's exacerbated all this, for your viewers who may not be aware, the Democratic Republic of the Congo was a country that was beset with autocratic rule and civil war for about a quarter of a century. Its democracy today is relatively new. It's fragile. Just about a month ago, about 6 weeks ago, there was a coup attempt against the current government. So it's already a country that's fragile in how it behaves. On top of that, there was a very interesting interview that the president of the DRC gave to French media about 6 or 7 weeks ago, just before the coup. And he said relations with the West have soured. He said some of his best trading partners are Russia and China, because when China comes in and they said, we want to do some mining deals with you, and oh, by the way, can we build you a hospital? He says they like that in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He says when the West comes in, like the US, we lecture them. We say, we want to do a deal with you. And by the way, there are things in your society we don't like. Let me tell you what's wrong with them. He said the whole attitude by the West, and he's referring to Western Europe and the US, he called it arrogant, condescending, and offensive. And so there comes a point where sometimes our business relationships and our diplomatic relationships have to work together, or we're going to find ourselves in a bit of a challenge. Again, it all goes back to the case of manganese and cobalt, 2 of the most critical elements, are found almost exclusively in one country in the world, and China controls those.
Another interesting part of this, Mark, I think, is you touched on it, the charging stations and the strain that might put on an already taxed power grid across the country. We've seen power grid outages, in different parts of the country over the last 10 years or so. So we're going to put these up and they're going to charge, great, but not every community, including right here in the Ohio Valley, is prepared to have that influx of need for power and to power those charging stations.
Oh, you're absolutely right, Dylan. The challenge is we tend to think, okay, there's no fossil fuel. This is a pretty good thing, right? But we still have to juice up the batteries. We still have to charge them. And by the way, 60% of all source material for our electrical power grid is fossil fuel. Another 19% is nuclear. So nearly 80% of all sourcing for the electrical power grid comes from either fossil fuels or nuclear, something for people to keep in mind. So we're taking fossil fuels to build an electrical system to charge an EV to get away from fossil fuels. Some might look at that and say, well, that doesn't make complete sense. But you're right. Places like California, which has struggled in the last decade and a half with rolling brownouts, the last couple of years, they've been putting out notices, the utilities in California, telling EV owners, please don't fully charge your vehicle. You're putting a strain on the grid. What happens when people who have chargers at home? They come home from work, they plug their vehicle in, and they go to bed for the night, wake up in the morning, and hopefully it's charged. Utilities in California are saying, please don't do that. Just partially charge it because we're straining the power grid. And this is outside the scope of our investigation, but right now California is struggling with its electrical demand, and there's no positive encouragement over the horizon that's going to get resolved anytime soon. So if we start bringing more large vehicles with batteries into the power grid to charge them, it makes sense. There's going to be a continued strain on the power grid. And you mentioned the charging ports. So McKinsey is a global consulting firm. And this past year, they said that in order to meet the president's goal of 50% EV sales, that would mean ultimately about 33 million EVs in the marketplace. McKinsey says there's a need for about 28 million charging ports to support those 33 million vehicles. Right now, they're about 2 million. So to get from 2 million to 28 million by the year 2030, we would have to build 12,000 charging ports every single day in America in order to get that goal. That's a tall order. As one of our experts, Bob Gallion, who is an engineer who's in the battery business, said, he finds it unlikely that there'll be enough copper available to build these charging ports. Charging ports can be simple, low volume at home, but there's also the commercial ones or those at businesses. That's going to be a bit of a challenge. Just to make certain the nomenclature is understandable by your viewers, they've heard charging stations, charging ports. What does that mean? A charging station could have one charging port on it, or it may have two or three. People probably seen videos or photographs of what looks like a gas pump, but it's a charging station. And they typically have two charging ports on it. You can charge two vehicles at a time. So we use charging ports because that's the figure McKinsey uses. 28 million charging ports could theoretically be 14 million charging stations.
Mark, the prices of EVs are significantly more than your gas counterparts. That was what you guys mentioned in that, and you see that with the sticker price, and people might be pushed away from EVs just because of that. And is that a concern in of itself, the pricing when someone's looking to purchase a vehicle?
Well, it's interesting. Again, for the early adopters, price doesn't seem to be as big a concern than it might be for the family of four with kids who go to soccer practice and have scouting activities and have other obligations in their community. So for the high income earners, not a big deal. But for the people on a budget, absolutely. That's why the federal government has come out with tax incentives up to $7,500, a tax incentive on people's income taxes if they purchase an EV. That helps, but in general, and this is a very general statement, when you take a look at like models of car, you take a particular manufacturer and you have a model, you have the gas version and then the EV version. In general, the EV version costs $14,000 more than the gas version. So even with a $7,500 rebate or a tax credit, if you will, that's still a $6,500 difference. Now, the EV manufacturers say, look, maintenance is lower. You don't have to do things like put oil into the cars like you used to. It's a little easier to take care of. Yes and no. One of the things we learned in our investigation is while a set of tires will typically last 50 to 60,000 miles on a gas vehicle, they last about $13,000 to $14,000 in EVs because EVs are much heavier cars that put more wear and tear on tires. So there are things that we are now learning in terms of the maintenance costs for EVs. Another part of this is what happens when the battery gets replaced. And what we have found, and again, there's no particular study that we've come across, but according to dealers, if an individual, an EV owner is lucky, they can get a replacement battery maybe for $12,000, but they're often in the neighborhood of $20,000. So someone can spend $65,000, $70,000 on an EV, have it for a number of years, it's out of warranty, they find out the battery has to be replaced, and they have to drop another $20,000. That's a bit of a concern. We cite in our investigation a study from Harvard University that took a look at that particular issue. And it said, due to the maintenance cost that one has to put into an EV with the expected replacement of a battery, that an EV owner would have to drive 159,000 miles in a 6-year period. That's about 27,000 miles a year in order to achieve a savings on an EV over that of a gas vehicle. Again, for the price conscious consumer, that's a pretty big challenge. So those are the concerns that a lot of the buyers have that we've been told by the dealers. There's one other point to address. China, who makes more EVs than anyone in the world, was poised to start importing a lot of EVs into this country. But in May, President Biden sent out an executive order putting a 100% tariff on the price of Chinese imported EVs. Essentially, he's doubled the price of a Chinese EV. So they aren't the cheaper alternative for the price conscious consumer. So yeah, it's still a challenging time, and your viewers know better than us how challenging the community, how challenging things are financially in the marketplace today. Groceries, fuel, utilities, rent. We live in challenging times economically, and for someone to take on a large expense of a vehicle, particularly when they're not certain where they're going to fuel it up, that is, charge it, it does give them pause. And those are all the comments that we were told by the various dealers. People who are considering a new car oftentimes dismiss an EV as being a practical alternative to perhaps the minivan they drive today.
Just a couple more for you here, Mark, as we continue to discuss the road ahead for EVs and the debate or discussion, rather, between the gas car, the electric car, or a hybrid model of it. Mark, you cited the 1690 rule from Toyota in your piece. What does that tell us as a country and also as a consumer?
Yeah. So Toyota is a very successful auto manufacturer. They do a very good job of selling vehicles. They're pretty good at what they do. They have led in this country the sales of hybrids. Toyota Prius, perhaps the most well-known. So they kind of understand selling cars. They understand selling hybrids. They have been a little reluctant. They've not been as forward about selling strict EVs as have other car companies. BMW, as an example, started to push the sale of EVs. Mercedes started to push the sale of EVs. They both have now backed off because sales have stalled. They're not there. Toyota we were able to get some internal documents from Toyota Motor Corporation, and they have what's referred to as the 1690 rule. And they said the critical minerals, remember I talked about those that are found in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, controlled by China, the critical minerals that go into making a single EV, like a Tesla as an example, can be used to make 6 plug-in hybrid vehicles or 90 hybrids like a Toyota Prius. Their argument internally is that from a critical elements perspective, it's much more efficient to build hybrids. Further in the document, they also happen to mention, and I don't mention this in the story, but they believe that those 90 hybrids will be better for the environment collectively than the single EV that's sold. So their position is, let's focus on hybrids. We think this is the solution because of the amount of materials that are available, because it's better for the environment, and not push the EV as much. One more point about this, the president's executive order will accept EVs, counting those towards the number of the 50% sales goal, and plug-in hybrids. But they will not accept just the plain old standalone hybrid like the Toyota Prius. I specifically asked this administration official who spoke to us a background, was very generous with their time, but did not want to go on the record. And I said, would the administration consider backing off that prohibition or lack of consideration of hybrids? Would you consider hybrids in that 50% sales goal? And they said, absolutely not. They do not want to even consider hybrids. They want hybrids to go away completely. They believe that people who buy a plug-in electric vehicle, a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle today, will transition to an EV the next time they buy a vehicle. I'm not sure what they're basing it on. There's no data, there's no evidence, there's no studies that we're aware of that says it's going to happen. They might be right, but we don't know what they're basing that decision on. So right now, Toyota can sell as many hybrids, as many Toyota Priuses and similar vehicles as they like, but they're not going to count towards the 50% sales goal the president wants to reach by the year 2030.
Mark, is there anything that you would like to touch on that maybe I didn't pull out of the story? Any headlines or topics you wanted to hit on?
You know, this whole thing is really challenging because I would say that the goal is noble. In general, we believe it's better to have a cleaner environment. Absolutely. No one's going to disagree with that. But there were some preconceptions involved in this process. For some of our viewers who may be older like me, we remember the days of the 60s and 70s when a car could drive down the road and was pumping out all sorts of noxious fumes from the tailpipe. Today's brand new gas vehicles that are sold are 99% pollutant free. They're virtually emissions free. So these aren't the cars from the 1970s. These are much cleaner cars today. So the argument that an EV is better for the environment, well, not really. Again, citing the Harvard study pointed out that it has to be at least 56,000 miles driven by an EV before it starts to get a little better in terms of how kind it is to the environment over a gas counterpart. So fossil fuel vehicles today and EVs are very similar in terms of emissions issues. So that's a kind of a significant point. The notion that we have an electrical power grid that could support this is overstating things. Clearly, there are challenges in electrical power grid, and there aren't any major efforts to improve the power grid on a national basis. Some states, some regions are more challenged than others. So that's a significant issue. Some of our viewers may recall during the cold snap that passed through the country, in fact, the North American continent this past winter, there were places in the northern US and Canada where people talked about their EVs weren't working at all because the weather was so cold they couldn't even get the batteries to operate properly. They wouldn't keep a charge for more than a few minutes. So there are certainly some challenges. I think Jack Fitzgerald perhaps said it best when he talked about what the future holds. He believes it's going to be a combination of EVs and hybrids and fossil fuel vehicles. What that mix looks like, we won't know. But he doesn't think fossil fuel vehicles are going to go away completely. He doesn't think EVs are going to be the complete future. It's going to be some combination. And at the end of the day, he said the customer makes that decision. He or she is going to decide what they want to drive. And that's how they're going to spend their money. And that's what's going to drive this process going forward.
Mark, I want to ask one final question. You do these investigations, you talk to a lot of different people, get a lot of different facts and figures and numbers. What was the single most fact, figure, or piece of information that you gained that you just thought was fascinating?
Well, this is probably really, it's a great question, by the way, and I'm going to give you a really bad answer. Perhaps the most startling thing is going to be in our next investigation on the topic of EVs. Will be coming out in the next several weeks. There was an element of this investigation that frankly stunned me. And we're finishing up this investigation, but this involves elements of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And there's some chilling aspects to what's taking place right now in those mines. And this is something that really hasn't been addressed in this country. In fact, it really hasn't been addressed in the West because it doesn't really fit the narrative when it comes to the notion that EVs are good all the way around. There's some ugly downside to it. And we've been working with this with our attorneys to kind of get the story together. And so it's a bit of a tease. We don't have an air date yet, but I expect that to come down the pike here in the coming weeks or so.
All right, Mark, I appreciate that. I also appreciate you taking some time to break this down and dig a little bit deeper on the future of EVs and what might be in store. Mark Hyman, Sinclair national correspondent. Mark, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Dylan.